A simple reflex arc is what occurs in the nervous system, and it's similar to other reflex arcs that you're going to learn about later in the nervous system in later chapters, but it kind of includes the parts of a feedback system as well. So it begins with a receptor that senses the stimulus. Stimulus can be anything, either internal or external. Could be something internal like a chemical. Activating a receptor could be something external like pain or temperature activating a receptor. Then that signal is conducted to the spinal cord, and that's conducted via an afferent pathway. And notice at the afferent pathway, it enters into the back of the spine. And this is what we call a dorsal root ganglion. And remember, that means that it's a unipolar neuron because it has one cell body. This represents the axon terminal where a neurotransmitter is released. That neurotransmitter then is released at the synapse, binding to the interneuron. The interneuron is within the central nervous system where integration happens. The integration region decides then what to do. There is then a motor neuron which conducts the efferent pathway, which is the motor neuron, back towards the effector. And the effector is where the response is produced. Many times the effector is a muscle or it's a gland. So in chapter 9, you looked at this pathway, but it was for the voluntary or the somatic nervous system. And acetylcholine is what activated or excited the skeletal muscles. So again, the little dots represent the neuron cell bodies, and what looks like a Y looks like the receptive endings or the axon terminal of a neuron. And again, this is within the spinal cord, which remember is at the central nervous system. Reflexes can also happen in the brain, which would also be part of the central nervous system. So for this chapter, it's important that you know the different parts of that flow chart at the beginning of the chapter where it breaks down the parts of the nervous system. On this slide, we can see types of neural circuits. And individual neurons are going to be responsible for sending, they're responsible for sending or receiving information. And as we know, they can be either excitatory or they can be inhibitory. So when there's a large collection of neurons, that pattern is what is called a neural circuit, which is what we're going to look at here. There's four main neural circuits. There's a diverging circuit, a converging circuit, a reverberating circuit, or a parallel after discharge circuit. So these circuits, they don't really change over time, but the strength of the circuit or the pathway within the circuit can definitely change over time. So the circuits change over time. And when they change over time, this is a beautiful part of the nervous system called neuroplasticity. So if we think about what plastic means, it can be molded to fit different, shapes. That's the same thing with a neural circuit. And it's the formation, it's kind of the basis for memory and learning. So when you are working on your memory in this class, learning new things, you are essentially affecting the neural circuitry. So let's look at these four different examples. For a diverging circuit, there is one input and many outputs. That's why it's an amplifying circuit. And an example would be a single neuron in the brain activating 100 or more motor neurons in the spinal cord and thousands of skeletal muscle fibers. So this is the example that you learned in chapter 9, where acetylcholine affected the skeletal muscles. And in this case, the acetylcholine worked as an EPSP. A converging circuit is kind of the opposite, where there's many inputs, but only one output. So it would be a concentrating circuit. We see three different inputs here. And this could be an example of where several sensory stimuli elicit the same memory. So let's say, for example, that there's somebody you see in a crowd that looks kind of familiar that might remind you of an X. Maybe there's a certain smell of a perfume or cologne that reminds you of an X. Also, maybe a certain sound. All of those represent different inputs that elicits a memory, which may not be that good, or it might be great. A reverberating circuit is where we have a signal traveling through a chain of neurons, each feeding back on the previous neuron. And it's an oscillating circuit like a rhythmic activity. So it could be involved in the brainstem for breathing, the sleep-wake cycle, or repetitive motor activity such as walking or learning to ride a bike. So if somebody has had a stroke, to the neurons in the brain that were used to learn to ride a bike, they have to relearn that activity. And finally, we have a parallel after discharge. This means that there is a signal that stimulates neurons arranged in parallel arrays. We see these three different parallel arrays, and they eventually converge on a single output cell. So an example of this may be involved in exacting mental processes like mathematical calculations.